Now I request Professor Sudha Vasan. Professor Sudha Vasan is a professor and head of Department of Sociology, Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi, India. She received her doctorate from Yale University in 2000 and has held research and teaching positions at Yale University, USA, London School of Economics, UK, Australian National University, IIT Bombay, and Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. She teaches and writes on political ecology with a focus on how gender, caste, class, and indigeneity intersect with ecology and environmentalism. She has published in international and national journals such as Journal of Development Studies, Journal of Developing Societies, Economic and Political Weekly, Sociological Bulletin, Journal of Human Ecology, on political ecology of community forestry, sacred groves, tiger tourism, ecological nationalism, and ethnography of forest guards, among other sociological issues. Professor Sudha Vasan.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a privilege to be here and listen to this entire panel. And what I'd like to do is sort of, since I'm coming after such important and illustrious thing that I've learned a lot from, is I really want to invite you for the next 10, 12 minutes to think with me. I'm simply a student and a teacher of society, and it's from that perspective that I want to think through the idea of heritage. And as teachers do, I'm going to go back to the basics and say, okay, let's think about what we can think is heritage today. Who decides what is heritage? And that, of course, very closely linked to our ability to protect, to conserve, to think of protection of heritage itself. I also want to begin with the idea that this is something that is being thought about globally, and I'm sure all of you are also aware of it, that there's actually been a revolution in thinking about heritage and heritage conservation in this century. Right? 2003, we go back to UNESCO actually agreeing that intangible heritage is something that we need to think of today. And that really is what I'm going to ask us to think to ask you to think together along with me, as how do we identify, think about, and conserve something that is actually intangible, right? How do we so for that reason also is why I chose not to put up slides today. I will talk about some landscapes in India, but I also want to wonder with you, if something cannot be counted, if something cannot be photographed, we're saying it's intangible, right? It's something that's processual, something that's changing every minute. And we had natural examples of that in all the presentations here, whether it's the example right from our keynote speaker who started off with the idea of inequality and how that persists today, to whether you want to think of water or river, something that is constantly in flow, right? So what we are looking at and what we are trying to conserve is actually a process rather than a thing. If that is the issue, if what we are trying to conserve is heritage, and I'm going to talk about nature and culture more specifically, I think what we have today in this century is perhaps a new challenge compared to what we thought of. Given all the good work we've done in terms of thinking of the past and how we are able to present that to our future, I think today we are at a juncture where we've started thinking about how do we conserve something that constantly changes, right? And of course, with nature, we've heard about it. I'm going to bring in the cultural side. Going back to the convention in 2003, the UNESCO convention, since then, there has been a lot of debate across the world on what is it that we want to call heritage, right? Earlier, you had the idea of cultural heritage and you have the idea of natural heritage, and the third category we had was mixed heritage, where you think of cultural and natural properties as being important. But this century, we've also added another dimension to it, and the dimension is of it being intangible. I want to talk about three dimensions of intangible heritage that I think are important for us to think about when we think of conservation, but also in terms of management itself, since all of us are also interested in practice, right? The idea is not just to theorize about this. But the three conceptual ideas that I think are very, very critical when we want to do anything with intangible heritage. The first, of course, is the idea of social nature. I think all of you in this room, as you practice, and everybody on the panel today, I think I've come at this idea from very different directions. Similarly, as just as with the title of this session, where culture really cannot survive or thrive without nature. I want to add the flip side of that as well, that there is no nature without society. And I don't mean this in a philosophical sense. I mean it in a very, very practical sense, right? Philosophically, philosophers can sit down and think about whether there is, if a tree falls in a forest, whether it really did fall. That is not the question that I want to pose for us to think about. What I want us to think about is that what we often see as these beautiful landscape, as things that are things of beauty, of universal value, within them is embedded incredible amounts of history, society, culture, and I would add specifically social power. Yeah? And when we want to think about sustainability of conservation, that I think the fact that people feel an ownership and people really want to be common people, and people who are not among the privilege of this society really want to feel an attachment, a pride in that heritage, I think we need to fundamentally address the issue of power as well, which again, as I was introduced, come from my research itself, where I think we do need to fundamentally talk about social stratification in a place like India, anywhere in the world, but definitely for us. So social nature, and the example that I wanted to present before you, is really these beautiful landscapes up in the Himalayas above the tree line that are called bugyals, at least in the central Himalayas, right? These are beautiful landscape, and I think some of them are also natural heritage sites. The Valley of Flowers is one example. I'm sure there are many others. But if you look at these bugyals, and if you look at it as a sociologist, as I do, what you recognize is this particular landscape and the natural beauty that we are able to recognize there is actually coming through a deeply historical, political, social, cultural process. The bugyal itself doesn't look the same way in every season, nor are the seasons fixed. So October this year, if I have a photograph of the bugyal, and October in another year I had a photograph of the bugyal, in one year it could appear as a landscape without people. In another, it could appear as a landscape with a number of, with hundreds of people actually in this bugyal. But what I also want to add there is what we see even as the pristine, that year when you go to one of these meadows and you see it as a people-less landscape, is the fact that the kind of species that are there, the kind of slopes that are there, the kind of water quality or the diversity, the ecological diversities that is there, is actually a product of pastoralism, a kind of way of life where over many, many, many generations, there have been communities that have taken their flocks, they have pulled out particular plants that they thought of as weeds, and they have planted others which they thought were particularly useful to them. It is also the product of colonialism, of land and property understanding that has come, the idea of private property that has come in with colonial rule in India. It is also the product of development desires that have come in more recent times. Well, they were there earlier as well, that have been democratized in more recent times. So, in some sense, what we identify as something that we want to conserve actually has embedded within it society, culture, and power relationships. So, social nature is one of the, I think, critical and challenging ideas that has come within the heritage debate, globally, and I think in India as well. The second sort of idea, concept that I think is critical is the idea of living heritage. Till about, I think even 20 years ago, these two terms put together would have been an oxymoron, right? You think of heritage as something of the past that we need to preserve as is. But the idea of living heritage, once you come, even within the UN system after the 2000s, the idea of a living heritage means that we are saying, this is something that humanity is constantly using and changing. So how do we protect and preserve, if we still want to use that term, something that is constantly being changed and used by people. There's several examples that we could get to, but I think I will run out of time if I go into them, so I won't go to that. The third kind of thing that has happened with heritage, within the heritage discussion, and I think it's important for us, is the democratization of the idea of heritage. Right? This is where, again, I will bring in the idea of caste and gender as being central. Across the world now, there is a recognition that heritage is not simply what the elite in any society or the rulers can identify as things that are of universal value. So, what is heritage now cannot be the preserve of those who are privileged to identify. And this, I think, changes. And you can see this change when we move from, the definition of cultural heritage that used to be there, where we were protecting artifacts, built environments, to the movement towards natural heritage, where we're already saying that perhaps it's not just the culture of rulers that needs to be protected, to now, when we think of intangible heritage, we're actually moving to everyday lived lives of people as also being of universal value. So across the globe, you find people talking about rice fields, in the Philippines, in the mountain regions, as being heritage of universal value. I think we in India are particularly richly endowed in this kind of thing, because of the diversity of ecosystems we have here, but also because of the diversity of people we have here. I mean, if you start thinking about the number of languages, the number of indigenous cultures, the number of subgroups that are there within our nation, we are actually extremely rich in this kind of intangible heritage. And here again, I will not go into the example, but to leave you quickly with a glimpse of an example. When you think of river islands on the Brahmaputra, I would think of them as very much social historical products of colonialism as much as of the people who live in that region. And you can think of, tangible heritage such as, large structures that are there, sacred forests, sacred landscapes, and things like that, which are all extremely important and recognized. But now perhaps we will also have to add the intangible element to it, where you actually have community, indigenous groups like the Mishing, who live on the borders of these river islands and live with the flood, whether it's in stilt houses, which might still be tangible and we could identify them, but also in the way that they are constantly mobile. So mobile populations like pastoralists, migrants, often seen negatively in most other contexts, need to be now looked at as potentially of universal value. People who know how to live without, live lightly, as the saying goes, rather than construct and build, things that actually are detrimental. What this leaves me with in the last few minutes I have is that the concepts that I lay down, that I've asked you to think with me, the idea of nature being social, the idea of heritage being something that we live with and living heritage, and of course the third, that what is heritage, what is valuable, how do we conserve it now, is there's an increasing demand that they be democratized. So you cannot have expert knowledge alone, right? Recognize expert knowledge alone that comes in and talks about how we conserve them. I want to add that these things actually make conservation of heritage actually very, very challenging. Challenging in new ways than they were. It wasn't that they were not challenging before, but even more challenging. And that is where I think we in India have a lot to contribute to the global discourse. Rather than being followers and saying, UN has asked us to identify intangible heritage and therefore we can, find these. I think we need to change that discourse as well from a Eurocentric perspective and talk about how lived realities of India are actually something that that needs to be integrated or thought about by the rest of the world. And I think processes or challenges like climate change, in fact, make this even more imperative today. Because with dealing with something like climate change, we're actually saying, how can we live lightly on this earth? And for that, we do need to look at communities that are, in fact, not privileged in India. I just want to end. I'm almost out of time, but I'll take one extra minute. That one of the things that I think would help us here, these are more suggestions about directions we could move in meeting this challenge. I think one of the things that's important that we often see as social anthropologists is that often nature in distress, if you're looking at nature in distress, it's worth looking around and you also find people in distress. So, this idea of social and nature as co evolving and co producing each other. So, when you look at degraded ecosystems, when you look at things that are marginal, ecosystems that are marginal and you wish to protect them, we often tend to look at perhaps cultures of the past, but I think in the present there are also communities in distress that are often living with that heritage that we wish to conserve. The one other aspect that I think would help us move is really thinking through interconnected scales. And that is where what I do and what I teach, the idea of political ecology, I think has something to contribute. Because one of the fundamental ideas here, that is, anything that you want to look at, you're interested in protecting, you need to start looking at interconnected scales of things that influence that thing. To give just one example, if you're looking at water, or if you're looking at rivers, we look, of course, at the communities that live around them and which might also be degraded or in distress. But I think the connections go much higher to the national and the global level. So, for instance, the air conditioning we have in this room, I would say, has an impact on the quality of the Ganga or the quality of drinking water. And political ecology is really a framework which allows us to do this kind of thing, to not miss either the trees or the forest, to be able to see the communities that are actually surviving in direct association with what we want to conserve, but also then reflecting back on communities like myself, the one that I would belong to, that would appreciate nature or a heritage that is available to me and conserved, but how my lifestyle then is also interconnected to the conservation process that I'm interested in. So I'll end right there. I think what I want to leave you with is this idea that conservation, or heritage in particular, heritage conservation, is in fact at a crossroads where I think there is a radical shift in thinking that is likely to change our view of heritage conservation for the next generation. And we today are in this location in India where we should probably be at the forefront of influencing this rather than simply following what we've done in the past, or rather building on what we have done very well in the past. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Vasan, for giving us a different perspective totally, actually. Very, very interesting.